Okay, my name is Mushtaq Khan. I'm a professor of economics at SOAS, University of London. So let me say a little bit about how I started working on political settlements. It was a very long time ago. I was a PhD student at Cambridge, and I was working on a thesis which was looking at a comparison between South Korea and Pakistan in the 1960s. And superficially, these countries were very similar. They were at that time both authoritarian regimes. They both had very similar policies. They had outward-looking, export-oriented policies. They were backing a small number of very large, diversified holding companies, and they were pumping a lot of public resources into those companies to acquire competitiveness and export growth. And they both had quite a lot of corruption and informality. And yet, the outcomes couldn't have been more different. Pakistan had a spurt of growth in the 1960s, and then the economy went into a serious crisis. The country split up in 1971, and South Korea continued to grow and become an OECD country. And so my question was, how do you explain this? And the answer I came up with was political settlements, because that was looking at the distribution of power and capabilities at different levels of society. So normally when political economists talk about policy, they look at how do you actually come up with a policy? How do you construct a coalition of interests which will be behind the policy, and how do you get that into law? And what I was figuring out was that the policies look very similar, the institutions look very similar, the political regime looked very similar, the corruption looked very similar, but the outcomes were different. So you had to go beyond the policy to what is the fundamental interest of the political settlements analysis, which is implementation. How do you implement stuff? And there you have a very different configuration of power and interest, not just at the top of society where the policy is being made, but right down through the different layers of implementation to the point of implementation. And that is where a lot of variation happens across countries. So you can pass laws and you can pass constitutions and institutions and so on, but the outcome will be different if you haven't figured out the distribution of power and capabilities. And then the really challenging task for us at the policy level is how do you design policy to work around a given political settlement to achieve the outcome you want. So the anathema of the political settlements approach is the absolute reverse, is the very concept of best practice and looking at what works somewhere else and then copying it. Political settlements analysis saying you can look at how another country achieved a good result, but then you have to figure out how to achieve that result in your context, given the very specific history of power and capabilities, and work the policy around that. So that is the history of the concept. So let me talk a little bit about Bangladesh over the last 15 years when it was led by Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League, which was effectively a one-party state. And this regime was overthrown in the July uprising of 2024. So that 15-year period when Bangladesh moved from what was effectively a very corrupt and not so well working two-party system into a one-party system was a fundamental change in the distribution of power in Bangladesh, which had very significant consequences for the type of development that could be achieved at a very macro level. And a lot of people misread that because their understanding of the distribution of power and capabilities was, in my view, inadequate or opportunistic, even in some cases. So what had actually happened? So if you look at Bangladesh in the 1990s and 2000s, it was a very typical developing country with competing client list parties. And a client list party is a party which creates support for itself by using state power to create opportunities, jobs, contracts, etc., for its supporters. And it distributes that in the form of benefits to your supporters, who then support you during elections and you win elections. So this is a very normal form of politics in developing countries. And there are a lot of variations in terms of the detail, but the big picture is quite similar. And so when you have a democracy in a developing country, it's a competitive clientelism, right? It's different clientelist parties competing with each other. It looks ugly and it has lots of costs, but it also has a system of checks and balances. Now, what happened around about 2008 and 9, and I won't go into the details, there was a big shock in Bangladesh. And that shock was used by one of the parties, the Awami League, to systematically destroy the other, which was the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP. And they did this with a number of tactics. One was to attack them for their corruption, and they were corrupt. They attacked them for some of their support for Islamist parties, which was a tactical thing that the BNP was doing, but the Awami League made it out like this is the party that will bring Islamism into Bangladesh. Remember, this was a period just after 9/11, and there was a lot of Western fear about the growth of Islamism in developing countries. They also had a lot of support from India, which wanted a client regime in Bangladesh because India had security needs. It wanted to access the Northeast without Bangladesh asking too many questions about what it would get in return. So there were a lot of actors who supported the Awami League for their own national interests or private interests. And the Awami League took this opportunity of destroying the opposition organizationally. Now remember, a political settlement is a distribution of power. So if you are able to organizationally destroy the opposition by locking them up, picking them up, disappearing them, hanging some of them, and basically taking over their economic institutions, their banks, undermining their economic capabilities, very soon what you had was a very concentrated distribution of power in Bangladesh. It effectively became a one-party state. Even though elections were held, nobody could participate in those elections. The ballot boxes were stuffed. On some occasions, the opposition didn't even bother to participate. Anyway, now, what is the economic consequence of this? And here is where the political settlements analysis comes in. A lot of people began to say, including the Awami League and many of its supporters, that the Awami League was now a developmental state because, look, China or South Korea didn't have democracy, but because you had one party in control, they could focus resources and they could drive development in a way this messy, noisy democracy couldn't achieve. So Bangladesh's development would accelerate. Okay. Now, people who made this comparison between Bangladesh under Awami League and China under the Chinese Communist Party were making exactly the same mistake as people who were looking at South Korea and Pakistan in the 1960s, authoritarian countries. Yeah, but the outcome was very different. And so in our analysis, we began to point out that, look, no, the configuration of power in Bangladesh is very different from China. China has a highly disciplined, almost bureaucratically organized Communist Party. And the Awami League is actually a clientelist party which doesn't control its own members. It's very undisciplined. When they are free from the competition and the checks from other clientelist parties, they will engage in a massive kind of corruption, which is much more damaging than the kind of corruption that the Chinese Communist Party engages in or the South Koreans engaged in the 1960s, because this would be actually diverting the very resources for development into something else rather than just getting a share of the benefits of development. Instead of getting a share of the profits, you're eating up your capital. And so that's a very different type of corruption, which happens when an authoritarian party loses control of itself. And so our prediction was that Awami League's development success, which looked very glitzy because they were borrowing large amounts of money from external lenders like China, and then building things at 3 or 4 or 5 times the real cost, and then transferring all that surplus out of the country into bank accounts in London and Singapore and Dubai and so on. That looting has a sell-by date, right? At some point, that Ponzi scheme collapses. And if you understood the real distribution of power in Bangladesh, you could have predicted that, and we were predicting it. We were saying, this is unsustainable growth. It's not going to sustain itself because it's overpriced infrastructure building primarily. It is not actually creating new industries. The industries in Bangladesh, the one industry it has, the garments industry, emerged in the 1980s under competitive clientelism, whereas this new so-called developmental authoritarianism in Bangladesh did not produce anything. So at that level, already you can see at a broad cut, by understanding the differences in the configuration of power between different types of authoritarianism, different types of democracy, you get a much better understanding of the sustainability of these models. So that's what we were doing during the Awami League's time. And so when the uprising happened, we were not surprised at all. And I was predicting that this government would fall for at least 2 years before the actual fall happened.